Okay, there's three parts to today. The first part is an input by me, and it's Christian anthropology in a complex world. So the relational person in a complex world, that's the whole sessions, or three. We've got three parts. So my one is basically Christian anthropology. I'll explain that in a minute. Then that's a very generic foundational input on 4 points. Then secondly, we're going to have a YouTube of a leading Catholic bioethicist, Dr. Bernadette Tobin, on a particular issue. So that particular issue is about, for schools, Catholic schools, on identity and gender. I'll talk about that shortly. So general, particular, and then finally, I'll then ask our new Chancellor, Professor Patrick, to come up and to engage in some conversation with us and each other about what's been said. So there we are. There's about 40 minutes. Now, the summary of my talk is in front of you. I'm sorry it's not typed out, but it's freshly baked about an hour ago. I just finished my meditation time and I had a bit of a thought stream. So there it is there. So it must be from God. And I'll get it typed up. We are filming this because mostly I think the people in your departments, wherever they are, I want everybody to hear the same thing at the same time. So if you know there's lots of people that should hear this but couldn't make it, and if you're a manager, I want you to take responsibility, please, and make sure everybody who works for you gets an opportunity of listening to this. Otherwise, we'll find that we're not walking together. So it's the year of walking together in the Archdiocese, and this is part of that. So there's the icon of Father Joe Tran, the parish priest in Narooma. It's the Emmaus scene, Jesus walking in front of, just a little bit in front of the two disciples, explaining to them all about God and about the presence of Christ. So in a sense, he's giving a talk far greater than anyone could ever think or imagine, but we're in the ripple effect of that, and that's very much why I wanted this to happen now, as we're just beginning the year of walking together. So off we go. 4 points. The first point is this, which you can see on the handout, and please feel free to make notes as we go on. What compass points do we draw on as foundations? So you may or may not be a Catholic, but you are working for the Catholic Church. What are the compass points we draw on our foundations? I mean, where are we coming from? And there's 4. So whenever over the last 2,000 years we Catholics have engaged with society, which is, please God, all the time, we always have at the back of our mind, whether conscious or unconscious, of 4 compass points. The first one is the Scriptures, the Bible. We say this is the Word of God. If you go to our Catholic Mass, you hear, this is the gospel of the Lord, or the Word of God. We all go, thanks be to God. So we don't say this is just any book. We say this is God's book, and because it's God's book, it's the Church's book. So our inspiration comes from the Word of God. It's inspired, especially the 4 Gospels. We don't say that somebody just made it up. We say the Holy Spirit inspired the 4 evangelists to write the Gospels. So there it is. That's the first thing. What do the Scriptures say about our current issues and the issues of our time? Secondly, we have the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which there's been many catechisms over the last 2,000 years. This one, about 25 years ago, is the latest iteration, and this summarises the tradition of the Catholic Church, which is the last 2,000 years. Over the last 2,000 years, what have Christians thought about the Word of God in their situation? And that's called the Catechism. So these are called, the tradition is called the words, plural, of God. The articulation of our reflected experience of the presence of God in the Word of God, in the Catechism. Thirdly, we defer to philosophy. So before we really ordain somebody as a priest or a deacon, or if somebody's going for a Bachelor of Theology or getting a degree in theology for teaching or whatever, he, she, they must do quite a bit of work on philosophy. I was speaking to somebody recently, and he thought that he was saying something good, and I thought, no, that's really bad. He said he's been able to finish his work and do all the theology, but I didn't defer to any of the philosophy because it's too abstract. And I thought, no, hang on. It wasn't appropriate for me to say anything. But I mean, I've studied about 4 or 5 years full time on philosophy, actually even before I got into basic theology, because you can't do theology without thinking right. So it's uncommon common sense today, but a lot of philosophy is just basically common sense, and we don't get this from the Christian resources. We mainly get it from Greek and Roman philosophers that predate Christianity. And we Christians have looked at that in different renaissances over the last 2,000 years, and as it were, baptized lots of Greek and Roman philosophy into our faith system. So it's very significant that philosophy is not an option, it's really part of it. And one of the difficulties today is that people don't think logically, or they don't think at all much, and it's all about sort of how do you feel rather than sort of what do you think. How do you feel is important, but also how you think's important too. Otherwise you become captives of ideology. The fourth one is descriptive sciences. So many of you would be perhaps be psychologists, social workers. Many of you would have done all sorts of work in sociology and the descriptive sciences, which are recent sciences. When you look at 2,000 years, these are more recent science. Psychology is a recent science over the last 100, 150 years, especially. But we defer always to saying, what do the descriptive sciences say about the human person? And there are 4 lights, 4 compass points that we've got a question here. How do we answer it? So we Catholics bring these 4 lights in. My observation is that generally when I talk to people in the secular arena, they tend to focus very strongly on the descriptive sciences and a subjective understanding of philosophy. What does it mean to me? How do you feel? What does it mean? What are your thoughts? Even the last few days, the last few weeks with the Queen, what was the feeling? What was the emotion? Now, all of that's significant, but it's not panoramic enough. So it's got to be also not just descriptive sciences. And some people say, oh, the church is so unscientific. Now, hang on. They say the church, that point of the church is unscientific. Hang on. We Catholics, we started the first universities. The first universities in the world are Catholic. Some of the greatest scientists were Catholics, are Catholics. The Big Bang theory of astrology, Catholic Jesuit priest. So we are not adverse to science. Science and religion, in our point of view, science and reason go, welcome! Sorry, weren't we? No worries. Yeah. Welcome. So there's that aspect too. So bringing the 4 of those lights into balance, when we do theology really well, those 4 lights are shining. When we do theology not so well, some of those lights are on and some of them are dimmed. That's my first point. My second point, how do we understand the human person? So we understand it along with Greek and Roman philosophy and mainstream philosophy over the last 2,000 years. We see the human person as a relational. So the human person is defined by 3 primal relations. This is not Christian Catholic, this is just basically ABC in philosophy. First of all, we're interrelational. Human beings are we're social beings. So we relate to each other. Secondly, we're religious. We have a religious instinct in us. So we are religious beings. Isn't it interesting over the funeral over the last few days? Somebody said 4 billion people watched the funeral. But in an age of wokeism, they've had a bad couple of weeks, the wokeism people, because people have come back to been fascinated by religious symbols and almost what I would call a sacramentality on all sorts of things, the meaning behind this object, the meaning behind that. So you can't suppress the religious instinct. It will not be suppressed because it's part of being a human being. We're in a very secularist society. Secularism means you put religion over here and you put culture over there, and never the twain should meet. No. We Christian Catholics come along and say that diminishes human dignity. It doesn't enhance it. that there is a place for the vertical dimension, the horizontal. And now we're, particularly with the ecological movement in the world, we're rediscovering the link between the cosmos, the human beings, and all created things like plant life, animal life, cosmos, the stars. And I was at a function last Saturday morning at Gungarland. The parish organised about ecological matters, and it's interesting that we Catholics are coming back. We've always been there with Franciscan spirituality, but we're coming to a deeper understanding through the leadership of Pope Francis and his document Laudato Si of 7 years ago about how do we relate to the non-human life that is here, and how do we respect it and show stewardship for it. Mind you, with every action there's an opposite and equal reaction. That's one of the rules of mathematics and physics, that people are fascinated by this, so they sort of focus on that and then they drop the ball on other important compass points. So we Catholics try to hold it all together, but the relationship we have with non-human life is dot, 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 dot. It's of a different nature than the relationship we have with each other and with God, but it must be there. Perhaps for another time we could talk about that. Third point, I'm making 4 points, here's my third point, the Christ event. So here comes the Christian dimension in a particular way, that Jesus Christ, our religious claim of Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He came into our world 2,000 years ago. His life, death and resurrection and the sending down of his Holy Spirit give us a transcendent dimension to everything. So it doesn't necessarily give us something that people who are Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim, we have nothing really in common with them at all theologically, because our theological compass point is that Jesus is the Son of God. So other religions might talk about an illumination, but we talk about an encounter, that Jesus Christ offers us an encounter with God. This is our basic claim. We are an encounter religion. There's only two major points about that. It comes through conversion and opening up your life to God. That's called grace and faith. It's on a sort of a circular manner. And there is a difference between a religious faith and a Christian faith. So, for instance, many of you might have come from a religious background. You know, your mum and dad, your grandparents were Christian or Catholic or religious sometimes. But what about you? Oh, no, I'm grown up. I don't need religion. I can work it out myself. And, well, hang on. You might be demeaning yourself because religious instinct. So you might have come from a religious background, but in this case, a Christian faith is where I make a personal decision that, no, I want to embrace this myself. So this is where you embrace that which is in front of you as a personal decision through the grace of God. So that's the essence of Christianity, because we're an encounter religion. Our boast is, believe it or not, you can have a personal relationship with God through, with and in Jesus Christ. No other religion says that. Only Christian says that. Only Christians say that. So that gives motivational and intentionality to all that we do. It doesn't necessarily make us superhuman beings in the sense that we have a philosophy or an objective understanding of the human person that nobody else has. No, I'm not talking about that. It's something quite particular. But it does give the dignity of the human person a deeper understanding. So all the good philosophies, the good descriptive sciences, all the scriptures and the catechisms over the years always talked about that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. There's a dignity of human life. But with the Christians, we come along and we say, yes, there is a dignity of human life, but we're actually made in the image and likeness of God. There's a spark of the divinity in our humanity. There's our boast. So it deepens the understanding of the dignity of the human person. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights was basically composed by Catholics. Some people tell me, you don't know anything about human rights. I said, don't talk like that. I said, we wrote the Magna Carta. So it doesn't mean that you had to be a Catholic to understand human rights and human duties and responsibilities, but it does give you a certain motivation, intentionality, and it does give us an understanding that this human being is just not to be given special preference because they're a human being, but we see God in you. We see Jesus in you. So that's the Christian aspect. Therefore, Christianity is a missionary religion. There's only two religions in the world that are missionary: Islam and Christianity. The others are more illumination religions. So we are a missionary. So we want to tell people about this. Hence we're having this meeting. We want to proclaim. This is good news, we say. The good news. It's not bad news. It's hope-filled news. It gives you hope, gives you meaning and purpose, and gives you an understanding that makes you get out of bed in the morning with great gusto, even if it's 0 outside. So we are an outward religion. We are not an inward religion. We are an outward religion in an inward, somewhat suffocating world at the moment. So there's the third. Now my fourth and final point is the following. So when I say we're a missionary evangelization community, what does that mean? I'll tell you first of all what it doesn't mean. Catholicism is not proselytism. We do not proselytize, even if some of us seem to do so. They're not being Catholic. We don't come up to people wagging the finger and saying, no, you've got to, that's wrong and this is right, and you've got to have Jesus in your life, otherwise you'll be damned and all that. We're not proselytizers. We have been in our history a bit, but that's because we've moved away from the 4 compass points. But at the moment we're at a real golden age of understanding what evangelization is. That's why this whole building is called the Archbishop's Office for Evangelization, because it's good news. We've got something wonderful to preach. So we are a theological community with in Australia, 3 major outreaches of evangelization: education, health, and social services. Now, if you want my blood pressure to go up, start using language like, oh, Bishop, you're a stakeholder. No, I'm not a stakeholder. I'm a father. I'm a spiritual father. A bishop is a doctor of the soul. Therefore, I'm in charge of the Catholic theological community of Canberra and Goulburn, which over the last 200 plus years since we've been in Australia, we've discerned that this evangelisation should be expressed non-verbally mainly. That's why we're not proselytisers. Good Catholic faith is non-verbal. It witnesses, it doesn't tell. A great example of that was that this morning I walked from home and there was a lady sitting on the St. Christopher statue, sitting at the base of the St. Christopher statue. And I said, oh, I'm glad you're liking our new statue. Oh, I love it, she said. Who is it? I said, it's called St. Christopher. Why? I feel very much at peace when I sit here. She said, I've sat here quite a few times, I feel peace. I said, well, St. Christopher, we've pointed it towards the Canberra Avenue because he's the patron saint of travellers, and when he was around, he was like a walking bridge. So he carried people on his shoulder across a very dangerous stream. He was a big man with big feet. And one day he found he was carrying Jesus. And, oh, is that what it is? And she felt, thank you so much. I didn't introduce myself. She didn't know who I was. I didn't know who she was. But I said, thank you very much. Now when I'm sitting here, I'll know a lot more about it. But I just feel peace here with this man with the big feet. See? That's evangelisation in a very Catholic way. Non-verbal. Happened this morning, an hour and a half ago. Non-verbal. Why have we built a lovely building? Why do we build cathedrals with spires on them so that architecture can help you to look to the heaven? A good church with spires, you'd look at it and you go like that. So as your head by the architecture moves to heaven, so may your soul. The greatest sculptures of all time, Catholic, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, the Pieta. Architecture, music. Last week, the feast day of Hildegard von Bingen, 1,000 years ago, a mystic, abbess, composed beautiful music. She's often on ABC Classics, and they say, oh, that's Hildegard. So they don't defer to the fact that she was a Catholic abbess, but her motivation there was, they said, oh, it's wonderful soul music, isn't it? This is the people on the radio. And say, yes. They stopped. They will not defer to the fact of her religiosity. Gave her the motivation and intentionality of composing the most beautiful music out. So there it is, everybody. We are a theological community, and we express ourselves especially to the poor, the lost and the lonely. And since we've been in Australia, we've picked out those 3 areas. The Plenary Council of Australia is picking out other areas as well. And so the next 5 or 6 years we'll learn more about that. So where our compass points are. But we must be on the peripheries, because that's where we say Jesus shouts out the most. Also, final point, through our Christian anthropology and the philosophy, we see ourselves as offering humanity as the service of purifying thought. So we get all sorts of, Patrick and I are looking at the moment with others about legislation at the ACT government and about like the euthanasia possibility here in the ACT. Why are we in the Catholic Church opposed to euthanasia? Because it's against our anthropology, and it makes terrible logic. The answer to people in those fragile things is very good, best practice palliative care, not turning around the medical profession to do what it's not set up to do, and that's to directly kill and be legally backed up by it. So we're not ideologues. We don't look out the window and see a partial truth. Because of Jesus Christ, we look out the window and we say we've got the fullness of truth, because Jesus is the fullness of truth, the way, the truth and the life. We try not to be arrogant about that, but we want to boast about it. So we see ourselves as purifiers. So one good example of that, and this is where I'll now lead on to the next section, is that in recent times, in our school setting, but I'm sure whether you're in health or whether you're in social services, same with you, with the gender issue. The gender issues, sexual dysphoria, identity and gender. So what can we do with our 4 compass points to assist people today in a very complex world, in the relational world, about a topic that is not mentioned in the Bible directly, but it is mentioned indirectly, and in the tradition of the church, not mentioned directly but indirectly. But we also defer to our philosophy. So when we look at a lot of the stuff on gender dysphoria, we find there's a lot of ideology. There's an ocean of ideology here. So we're not going to become ideologues. No, we're going to propose, but not impose something. We propose a broader panorama of the human person, rather than just seeing him or her in a particular narrow way. And that means that we're out of kilter with a lot of common thought. That's why people say you Catholics are a generation behind yourself. I'd like to think we're a generation in front of people, particularly in this area. I strongly predict, as with others, that in 50 years' time, most regrettably, there will be a Royal Commission about this particular issue, and how we have medicalised young people in this particular area, who then later on decide that they don't want to be that particular gender, and they go back and they say, I can't because my body's been mutilated. You watch it. There'll be 50 years' time, there'll be a pushback. But at the moment, there's a very strong move. If that's your choice, if that's what you feel, you should be supported in that. Now, hang on. We are like, the Pope Francis uses the word, we're the mother. We stand alongside our people, as close to the people, with the tenderness, like a mother with her children, especially those who are vulnerable. That's the image of the Catholic Church here. So we're not out there blowing trumpets, but we are saying, as a mother close to our people in our schools, we feel that there's a better way of doing it than doing what the legislation may force us to do. And therefore we propose a better way. Therefore we oppose that particular type of legislation, particularly with like legislation about euthanasia. There's a better way. It's only partial truth. There's a better way of looking at it. Mother close to the ones who are very frail and elderly or terminally ill. There's a better way than just giving them assisted suicide. So that's where I now stop. And we're going to have now a 13-minute YouTube by Dr. Bernadette Tobin on the sexual dysphoria issue. Now, she hasn't prepared that for this talk. She gave it in a more global way recently to all our education people here in the Archdiocese. But I thought it made a very good example of how some of those compass points that I'm mentioning, she's using that to critique what's going on today, especially in the philosophical way and in gender dysphoria. So here's a good example of a complex issue.
In Amoris Laetitiae, the Pope rejected, I'll come back to that word rejected, any theory of gender that denies the difference and the reciprocity in nature of a man and a woman. He went on to say that biological sex and the socio-cultural role of sex, that is, gender, can be distinguished but not separated, and that educational programs that promote the idea that personal identity and emotional intimacy are radically separated from the biological differences between male and female, these educational programs are intended to undermine the anthropological basis of the family. Well, there we have it, a Christian anthropology stated very clearly and simply. Human beings are not only both body and soul, you might say psyche or mind or spirit. There is a relationship between these two aspects of each person. Now, this view of anthropology is sometimes denigrated as religious because it is endorsed in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it doesn't depend for its cogency on any idea which could be known only by revelation. In fact, it draws on ideas about men and women that go back at least to the Greeks. So now I come to the elements of a Christian anthropology. A human being is both body and soul or mind or psyche. Aristotle explained the soul as the form of a living person. It's what makes, the form of a living thing or living being. It's what makes it what it is. So we're both body and soul. We're not just bodies and we're not just minds. A human being's sex is a physical, biological reality. Sex is how human beings' bodies are organised with respect to reproductive function. In fact, it's how all animals are organised, and no animal can change its sex at will. Each person's biological sex unfolds in the womb from conception onwards as complex genetic and hormonal processes combine to give each person a unique set of male or female characteristics. Apart from rare cases of people born with characteristics of both, so-called intersex people, every human being is born either biologically male or biologically female. Maleness and femaleness are characteristics of that dynamic whole, body and soul, which is a human being. Now, individuals experience and express their sex, their masculinity or femininity, in a wide range of ways. This sense of one's own sex is often called one's gender. Gender, in this sense, can be influenced by a range of early experiences in the family, at school, on social media, in the wider culture. Gender, in this sense, one's experience of one's masculinity or femininity, can change over time, can vary between individuals, can vary between cultures. Children often experiment with their gender, sometimes reacting against rigid gender stereotypes, and they sometimes experience incongruence confusion, distress at a discordance between their sex and their sense of their gender. A few are diagnosed with a psychological condition known as gender dysphoria, and there is much debate about how this condition should be responded to. So I come now to a couple of approaches which reject this anthropology, and I do this because I find that in order to understand a position, it helps me if I know where it is different from another position. So there are a number of approaches which reject this anthropology found in Christianity. One I'll call a transgenderist view, and it goes something like this. And of course, within this view, there are very many variations. It goes something like this: sex and gender are two entirely different things. Sex is assigned at birth. Children with male genitalia are assigned masculine and then socialised into masculine ways of thinking and acting. Trucks, action figures, footballs, etc. Children with female genitalia are assigned feminine and socialised into feminine ways of thinking and acting. Dolls, dresses, makeup, etc. Gender is not merely assigned at birth, but it's also subject to change, more or less at will. Gender identity is an entirely personal matter. It's a feeling or a desire which no one else can assess. It's fluid, so one can transition from one gender to another. And since it's a feeling, it ought not to be challenged by anyone else. Gender is a choice. Since gender is a choice, children should be encouraged to interrogate their gender. Since gender is a choice, children should be encouraged to make up labels for their gender, which cannot be checked by anyone else. Thus, the language of gender non-binary. Since gender is a choice, the category of female includes not only those who are born with female biology, but also anyone who, though born with male biology, feels he is a woman. Thus, gender non-conforming or trans. Since gender is a choice, the category of male includes not only those who are born with male biology, but also anyone who feels she is a woman. Thus, gender non-conforming or trans language. Now, this view relies on the idea that what matters most about human beings is their mind. In fact, some argue that until an individual can think and desire and choose, he or she is not really a person at all. The terms cisgender and transgender rely on this idea that sex is simply assigned by others at birth, and so it can be reassigned later. And one last thing, the policing of language. Some say that calling a trans woman a man is hate speech. The idea is that reality is made by language. So you have to silence people who don't agree that a trans woman is a man, because what people think makes reality. And if they keep thinking and saying these things, they are making a really bad world. Well, there are lots of other versions of the story which rejects Christian anthropology. Here's an older one, which I'm calling a radical feminist view. There are very many feminists who don't endorse this view. Sex and gender are two entirely different things. Sex is assigned at birth, etc., etc. But here's the key thing. Gender is the label by which societies and cultures assign superior and inferior status to men and women, respectively. From birth, a process of socialization prescribes behavior roles to men and women and proscribes behavior role to men and women, that is, requires and prohibits various roles. Males are taught to think they're superior to females and encouraged to be aggressive, assertive, etc. Females are taught to think they're inferior to males and encouraged to be weak and passive, etc. Of course, some individuals rail against these constraints, some acquiesce in them, some actually endorse them. And this view relies on the idea that cultures are inevitably patriarchal, that they always and everywhere teach the superiority of the male and the inferiority of the female. Now, before I finish this, I want to make this point, that though that transgenderist view and that radical feminist view reject the key elements of a Christian anthropology, they are not entirely different from a Christian anthropology. There are points of overlap with that Christian view. So, to give just two examples, cultural conventions can and sometimes certainly do endorse rigid stereotypes. And that's not a good thing. Cultural conventions can be and often are misogynist, requiring so-called female circumcision is a very striking, wicked example. But cultures which deny women opportunities for education, recreation, political involvement, and for freedom of thought and movement and expression are also unjust. So, by way of conclusion, Pope has said that we mustn't abandon people who are transgender, in inverted commas, but recall his rejection of any theory of gender which denies the difference and reciprocity in nature of a man and a woman. Why did he speak with such intensity against the teaching of any such theory to children? I can only speculate. I speculate in three ways. Because the children are being taught something that's false, because they are being taught something that undermines the anthropological basis of the family, or because fostering the idea that personal identity is entirely constructed by the individual may itself have contributed to the substantial increase in numbers of young people who experience gender incongruence. And I'll leave it at that.
I should warn you, I had an education very much like the Archbishop endorsed, and in a first year philosophy class, I was confronted with Aristotle's theories about the human person, which Bernadette explained really quite well, you know. Body, soul, and an emotive or mental capacity, mind, emotions, however. But all directed towards a life of flourishing, a life well lived, eudaimonia in the Greek. I'm sure everybody else in that class, a number of whom did academically far better than I did, embraced that question, answered whatever the essay was, and then dutifully left it behind to never be considered again. It, in fact, how we understand the human person became the focus question for my entire academic life. So I ended up writing my thesis on relational personhood. So forgive me if I get if I wax lyrical here. One of the things I think that has happened, and it has created some of the issues that I think we face, but it's happened probably in the last 100 years, is there has been an increasing turn to a kind of language about relationality. That some of the things that we would once have said as a church and as a society about objectivity, we wouldn't want to claim are wrong. The language just doesn't make any sense in the context in which we live now. On the other hand, the language of relationships and the things that go with that do tend to make much more sense. If you want, the Catholic Bookshop could order in my book. It's only €168, so a well worthwhile read. However, take my word for it, the summary is interpersonal relationships are the dynamic constitutive of personhood. That is, each and every one of us is a person because we were brought into existence by at least two other people. None of us are missing that element. The initial thing, and part of the reason why, even if you are irreligious, the Madonna and child images say something to us, is because that's a foundational relationship. And we all know that things do not go well for the baby if that bond doesn't work straight off. You know, it's not irremediable, there's not other things you can't do. And in this, it's not about gender. One of the researchers I did came up with this beautiful image of mother and child, and then spent the next 15 pages of his book saying, and I don't mean women and babies, you know. It's about the way we do this. When we offer those invitations that the Archbishop spoke about, part of it is someone has to make the invitation, and there needs to be a response. And that response can be a range of different things. So, you know, we don't like the invitation, we say no. And the relationship presumably doesn't progress very much further along that line. But as those things develop, they become more explicit. So you think most of our children, apart from the fun of knowing that they have, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 names, don't ever need anything other than their first name prior to going to school. Or childcare probably changes the dimensions of that a bit now. Why? Because, and you know, those irritating things, I think, if you've ever walked into a primary school classroom of John, A, B, M and K, because, you know, we happen to have gone through a bad year 5 years ago and John was the peak name. But until then, you don't need to know what the rest of the story is. So I am me and I'm absolutely unique and that's enough. But eventually you have to distinguish me from the other Patricks. And our surname does that, does a bit of things. I taught somebody once at university an incredibly female social worker whose name was Fiona Victor. Why? Because the ethnic culture she came from, everybody was expected to be named Fiona because it was the grandmother's name or whatever. To know which Fiona it was, she was given her father's name, as every other child in the village was, because this was the Fiona that came from Victor's part of the family. Now, you know, Fiona Victor, when she introduces herself, raises eyebrows for a range of reasons, but it also gives an opportunity for that invitation to be broadened out, that you discover what else there is about Fiona and why that's an important part of her culture. We plateau this stuff, it becomes sedimented in our lives, and as well as embedding us in relationships, it actually makes us more uniquely ourselves, because my experience of encountering each of you is different to yours. The way you respond to things. You know, one of those in you know, much younger years, but I'm told it still exists, when I used to go out drinking with friends, I was always amazed at the capacity of women of my vintage to be able to identify somebody across the room in a bar and say, that's a person who I wouldn't feel safe with. And you kind of go, looks like everybody else in the bar. And they go, nah, that guy I wouldn't feel safe to stand next to or whatever. I'm sure men are possibly capable of that. It's not something I've ever experienced. But why? Because their experiences of the world and their experiences of the way people interact give them that particular sense about that particular person, of which they might be wrong. Okay, this is a quote from this document, Created in Love, that I thought was useful. In the extraordinary beauty of creation, each unique human being, male or female, is to be received and appreciated, protected and nourished, respected and cherished. Christians are committed to respecting the dignity of every individual. No human person is able to be diminished or devalued, and all have an indispensable part to play in the human community regardless of differences. I think one of the things that goes with what the Archbishop was saying earlier about, and Bernadette, about my choosing particular gender or choosing particular aspects about myself, you know. So as my children constantly, you know, point out to me, humility is not a strong part of my, you know, personal makeup. They wished it was more part of my personal makeup. However, if just my saying, well, I'm choosing to be humble, and I probably could do that, but it's actually not going to have an effect. 62 years have embedded the fact that I just don't have that skill within me. You know, there are other things, just because we choose it doesn't mean it's going to be that way. You know? And I think it's one of the challenges we face in recognising that people are complex beings, part of which is determined. You know, my children are wonderful, genius, loving people who from the moment they were conceived had absolutely zero chance of representing Australia at the Olympics. They simply did not have the genetic wherewithal. Yeah? And that's a given. They couldn't alter that just by choosing to be different. Yeah? On the other hand, they probably also couldn't have chosen, my kids are book people. You know, they read books. If they have to, they'll read them online, but they prefer hard copy. It strikes you as an odd thing when you're growing up with children and you think that's normal. And every time you go somewhere, a professional in health, educational, social services says to you, that's very unusual. We don't see children with books.
You've all been sent that electronically. The second part of it is directed towards education, but the first half is generic, good Christian anthropology, which summarises quite a few points that we've done there. So you've already got some of it there in writing. This is a document that was approved by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference last year and has gone under all sorts of drafts and has just recently been published. Thirdly and finally, can I say to you as the Archbishop, this is sort of the take-home thing, please, if you forget anything else, don't forget this because it really is important. We are a theological community that happens to have an educational arm. We are not an educational community that happens to be linked with the Catholic Church somehow. We are a theological community that has a health outreach. We're not into hospitals and nursing homes, and we just happen to be Catholic. And we are a theological community that goes out through social services to anybody in need. We're not there as a philanthropic group that just happens in this case. I was not Anglican, you know, it happens to be Catholic. Please, I'm not just here for my good looks. I'm here as the servant leader, and this is what we do. We serve our people in the communities. We serve them. This is the mandate of Christ. Go out to the whole world and serve to the point of bloodshed. So everybody, thank you so much for your attentiveness, and I really appreciate you coming, and I hope this is the beginning of something that we can continue on in the times ahead in our own professional development, but also the fact is that if you work in the Catholic Church, you're welcome, and this is who we are. Welcome. Thanks very much, everybody.